allocate risks amongst parties, and we argue who should take what risks. And, usually what a contract reads in the end is something that would appear to be a fair allocation of risk. And so, but our market is different these days. And, so I found myself saying the title of this presentation a lot, which is, are you freaking serious? And so I thought, wouldn't it be fun to just kind of go over a couple things. It's not going to be a lot today, but we're going to go over a couple things that I'm seeing in the market. And then maybe open it up to see what other people are experiencing, because quite frankly, the market is a little bit like the Wild West right now. And I'm sure that each of you probably have an interesting experience over the last, let's face it, 7-8 months. So anyways, without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we'll just kind of go over, like I said, just some of the interesting things that I've seen over the last several months in our market, specifically as it relates to contracts and things of that nature. So hold on, I'll share and then we'll get started. All right, so you guys can see me now. Great. Ben, can you see me?
Yes, I see you.
Okay, great. All right, so the title, as you can see, is Are You Freaking Serious? And as I said, it kind of developed after I would hang up the phone or after I read a contract and see what parties are doing in our market. And I first want to say that I understand that the market dictates a lot of these things, right? And you guys have to structure contracts in order to sell properties right now. So I fully get where you guys are at in the market if you're representing a buyer and what that looks like for you guys. But I also think that we need to make ourselves aware of certain issues so that we can educate buyers in a way that protects you. And so a lot of this conversation really revolves around what I think you guys need to be doing to protect yourself when you're assisting buyers and putting together offers. And so that's really the slant I want you guys to take at it, understanding that a lot of these provisions, really in a perfect world, you wouldn't be putting in contracts when you're helping buyers. So with that said, let's get started. So as you can see, this is a crazy market, and sometimes in crazy markets, we run into crazy people that are willing to do whatever they need to do to get a deal the way they want it done. And in this market, if you're a seller, you can afford to be crazy. And in this market, if you are a buyer, sometimes you have to deal with the demands of a market that lacks inventory. So you might do something a little bit crazy. So, it's not an understatement to say that our real estate market has been crazy. And it's also the objective here is to sort of talk about the predicaments people get themselves in this market, as well as some common things that I'm seeing in contracts. So in this market, I find myself writing this email to buyers all the time to cover our collective, you can see. So, I'm just going to read it out. And so you can get a flavor for what people are doing. So hi, Billy and Bernice buyer. Currently, the way this proposed agreement reads, you have no right to terminate based upon inspections or financing contingencies. And your insert a ridiculous amount of a deposit here. Deposit is immediately at risk whether or not you actually make the deposit. except in the event that the seller defaults or there is a title problem. I typically encourage people to perform inspections on all properties which they buy, including general inspections, permit inspections, termite inspections, mold inspections, and radon inspections, to determine the condition of the home and reserve the right to terminate if those inspections reveal an issue. This right is not present in the proposed contract. Also, if you are borrowing money and cannot close the transaction without loan funds from your anticipated loan, I recommend that you make your obligations to close contingent upon obtaining loan approval. This right is not present in the proposed contract. This in our industry, we call this a Cya letter, which is a cover your blank letter. And the reason why we send this in large part has to do with making sure that people understand what they're signing and they don't blow back on me or an agent when one of these things bites them. And so, the takeaway that I want you guys to take away from this entire talk really is not that putting these offers out there that you shouldn't be doing it. It's more making sure in writing that you have covered conversations, which I'm sure you're having, and you can document that, that they fully understood when they signed the agreement what that meant. And that's really in large part, as I said, for your protection, or at least to prevent people from blaming you when things don't go as they would hope they would go. So one trend we're clearly seeing in our market is more and more is this idea that people are waiving inspections and purchase contracts. And, it began to rear its ugly head, for lack of a better term. Back probably 2 or 3 months ago, I started seeing it, and it's honestly becoming more and more popular. And I just kind of want to touch on some issues just so that we can get a flavor for what is possible when you waive inspections. Now, obviously, we know that there's always general ticky-tacky problems with the home, right? And every home, unless you're buying brand new construction, where you would, I guess, have a reasonable expectation that everything functions perfectly. Any resale home generally is going to have little issues, and most of them do just have little issues when you're buying them. But there also are some significant issues which bite buyers post-closing, particularly if there's not any inspections done. So I just kind of want to talk about, these 3 issues here. So permitting. And I know we've kind of talked about this before, but I always feel like we need to revisit these things when we're seeing new ways that contracts are being structured. So, just as a general reminder, unpermitted improvements are improvements where a permit was pulled but not finalized. Those can be problematic. And the reason they're problematic is not just for the cost of closing a permit, it's really for the cost of any inconsistent constructions with what code requires. So if any kind of improvement is made without a permit or without a final permit, a buyer always runs the risk of having to redo the work to make sure it complies with code if the existing improvements didn't apply with the code when they were built. So that liability doesn't stay with the person who built it. It actually travels with the buyer of a property, and it becomes the buyer's problem. And so a buyer—
This call for my company.
What's that? A buyer, sorry, I'm sure somebody just accidentally popped on. So a buyer, obviously, when they inherit a permit problem, also inherits the cost of remediating that problem. And so when you're not allowing for any inspection, and that includes permit pulling, by the way, because permits are an inspection item under the contract, they're not a title item. Then that permit issue travels with the property, and really the buyer is just holding out a blank check because they don't know. The second thing is mold. Whereas, some mold remediation can be minor, it is very possible that if you aren't doing mold testing, that the entire house needs to be re-drywalled. And so, again, that issue will travel with the property, and very often a mold problem is not even known by the seller, because mold travels within the walls. The seller may not know that there's an issue, and really there's no liability to the seller. If they don't know, there's really no reason they would have to disclose it, because they don't know it, and the law wouldn't hold them liable. So if you're not doing mold testing and there's a significant manifestation of mold, then you have a problem. The last thing is, while there may not be ticky-tacky issues, there might be structural issues with the property. And anytime there's a structural issue with the property, massive window leaks where the windows have to be replaced, or roof leaks, or things of that nature that deal with big structural items, obviously those aren't going to be discovered. And again, buyers would be subject to, that worry. So obviously when people ask a lawyer, is this a reasonable allocation of risk? Most lawyers are going to say, yeah, no, it's not. So lawyers cannot recommend this tactic. But we also recognize that in this market, that may be the only way that a seller is going to sell a piece of property to your buyer. And that may be that everybody's signing that. And so, an even-handed lawyer is going to say, look, I understand that this is the cost of doing business, but you need to understand your risks. And then you need to make a business decision about your risks. My job is not to tell you not to do it. My job is to say, here's your risks. And then, you guys figure out if that's an acceptable risk. And so in the legal field, as I said before, we would send the client an email about that. I recommend that you guys do that, whether or not you're using an attorney, or whether you're referring an attorney. I'd recommend that, when you put together an offer that has a provision like this in it, that you just simply, send them an email which just says something to the effect of, hey, per our discussion, typically people would try to get inspections done on properties, understanding that this market, sometimes that those are waived. You do bear some risk when you waive them. If you want to move forward, that's awesome. And I encourage you to do it, but just understand there's a risk here to you. That way, when people begin to point fingers, when they do discover these open permits or mold issues or structural problems, you can pull that email back out and say, hey, look, we did talk about it and you understood the risk at the time. I'm sorry that it's coming back to bite you, but we didn't really have a choice based upon the market, right? So, I just feel like that's a good practice for you guys, and you'll see this repeated throughout this whole presentation, this idea. The next thing we're seeing is a rash of buyers signing deals where they say they're paying cash, but they're borrowing money for their purchase. So we're seeing issues pop up on these, and I just kind of want to talk about these issues really quick. Obviously there's an issue with appraisal when we have markets of highly increasing property values. Then you have appraisal issues where they don't necessarily value the property at the value that perhaps your buyer was hoping for or needs in order to qualify for the loan. And if they have a cash deal, it doesn't matter if the property doesn't appraise. So that's an issue. Also, appraisals, just in general, appraisers are really working hard and they're delayed. And so I see issues where lenders are simply unable to bring money to the table because they're still waiting on the appraisal, or the appraisal came in really late and they have to do an appraisal review. And we know that on cash deals that sellers are not don't have the obligation to give an extension, right? They're not motivated. They don't have a reason that they would do that, particularly if there is a large deposit that they can take. So it's just a risk out there with appraisals. The next thing would be CD disclosure delays. And you guys already know this stuff about CDs and them being disclosed. And then there's a 3-day period that the loan has to basically allow for the CD disclosure before they can push out loan documents and close the transaction. So again, with this issue in a cash deal, they're not going to get an extension. And I mean, I'm honestly seeing and running into items 1 and 2 on a specific file I'm working right now that's supposed to close on Friday. And there's really not a good solution when we have a seller who has no motivation to give an extension, and the seller is eyeing a huge deposit, thinking to themselves, I can sell this again. The next one, survey orders and delays. So, surveyors are delayed right now. I think we all know that. Very often on cash deals, because a survey is not required, we recommend them, but they're not required. Because they're not required, generally, it may be that a buyer, or we believe that a buyer doesn't necessarily, as a closing agent, that they don't necessarily want a survey or need a survey. And because of that, maybe they don't get ordered on time, or they get ordered a little bit later than normal because we're waiting to find that information out. If we know that there is no survey and it's a finance deal, we order the survey immediately. If it's a cash deal where a survey is technically optional, even though that we recommend them, we will wait to order the survey until such time as the buyer authorizes us to order the survey. And so it does create a little bit of a pause or delay. And so, our takeaway on that, we'll talk about that in a second, but that's just an issue that's run into. The last thing is VA and FHA addenda. So if you have a cash deal, and this just happened, by the way, on a file last week with me. If you have a cash deal, but the buyers are trying to borrow money, and they're trying to borrow money pursuant to a VA or an FHA loan, you have to remember that part of getting those loans, the FHA or the VA will require an addendum or an amendment to the contract, which basically says if the property doesn't appraise, then the deposit goes back to the buyer. Now, if you're a seller or a list agent and you have a cash deal with no contingencies, and that deal has a deposit which is extremely large, and you're presented with an FHA or a VA addenda simply saying that if the property doesn't appraise, that the deposit goes back to the buyer, what is the likelihood that you as the seller are going to be willing to sign that? So that becomes an issue, because the VA and FHA will not close a transaction unless that addenda is signed. So if your buyer is counting on that and they've signed a cash deal, obviously you have a challenge ahead of you moving forward. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind when you're writing these offers, because of the specific requirements of the VA or a FHA loan. Now, again, while we don't recommend doing the above, we understand that in this market right now that there are extenuating circumstances where a buyer might be willing to take the risk. And so the one thing, just speaking on behalf of all the closing agents out there, is if there is no loan approval contingency in the contract, just make sure that you communicate right away to the closing agent that there is actually going to be a loan on this transaction, and give them the lender's contact information right away. And the reason I'm saying that is on this very specific file that we're dealing with, the VA and FHA addenda issue, no one, including the borrower and the agent, told us that there was actually a loan. So we, as the closing agent, have been treating this as a cash deal. The transaction is supposed to close. I guess this is another one. It's supposed to close on Friday, and we got contacted by the lender last Friday for the first time, and we started having to ask people, "Is there a loan on this?" No one's told us this, which means that we're scrambling to get everything to the lender that they need in order to get an approval. So if these are happening, if you're helping a buyer borrow money, I just would recommend that you specifically tell the closing agent at the very beginning of the file, and that you give them all the contact information for the lender at the very beginning of the file, so that they have it tagged as a loan transaction versus a cash transaction. Also, a Cya letter is recommended. So in this crazy market with crazy people, buyers are opening up their wallets for deposits, man. And it is insane what some of these deposits I'm seeing. I'm seeing people put deposits up which are larger than their cash to close requirement when they're borrowing money. So what I mean by that is, say you're going to borrow money on a cash, you put a cash deal together, right? But your intention is to do an 80-20, 20% down deal. And I see, buyers putting 30% up. So they're getting cash back at closing from their deposit. So, I think it does bear some conversations with buyers about what that means for them. So the first thing has to do with just the practicality of an escrow dispute. So in this market, I want you to put yourself in the position of a seller. So let's say you have a seller that has signed an agreement with a buyer, and that seller is looking at a $100,000 deposit. And there's an escrow, there's an inspection. This is one of the rare ones where you can actually inspect. So there's an inspection provision, and that buyer decides that they're going to terminate based upon the inspection and an as-is contract. Well, the practical matter of it is, a seller, although they ethically and contractually should agree to the release of the deposit, the only way truly to force them to agree to release the deposit is by virtue of a court order. As speaking from the perspective of an escrow agent, escrow agents generally will not release a deposit unless both parties have signed off on it or a court orders them to do so. And here's the specific reason why. So if an escrow agent looks at the facts and makes a unilateral decision to refund a deposit, that escrow agent now becomes the guarantor of that deposit. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're an escrow agent and there's a $100,000 deposit sitting in your bank account, and you know that one of the parties, or at least you suspect or believe that one of the parties should receive that money back. If you knew that by giving back that money, you were opening yourself up to liability from the other party to sue you for that balance, would you do it? And the answer is, most of us wouldn't. So the issue becomes, if you have a seller who is unethical, then a seller may not consent to the release of the deposit, and then buyers are out exorbitant amounts of funds until they can have a court order of those things to be released. That falls into the second issue. So let's say that happens to this specific buyer. Let's say that the buyer takes this huge chunk of money and they throw it down on a deposit, and they're in the middle of an escrow dispute. Obviously, they're still a buyer and they still want to buy another place, most likely. Have they essentially given away all of their cash position to where they can't buy another place until such time as the seller releases it? And then will that motivate them to settle for something less than what they're entitled to? So that first issue plays into this second issue, which also plays into this third issue. I am seeing people bet their entire life savings on deposits. And while I do understand that, I think people need to also understand that that's their entire life savings. So, I don't know that there's a great answer here as to what you should do if you're representing a buyer in this market in this time. But I do think people need to be educated about what their risks are. And again, one of those things would be a Cya letter, because if that first offer, if the buyer gets this type of an experience, they're going to have to wait on the sidelines while that deposit issue is being litigated. And honestly, that may cost them even more money as the market prices continue to rise. So just crazy thing, crazy people, crazy, open up your wallets for too big of money.
Jay, can we ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
Someone here has made a really good point, because
Yeah.
we were saying, we hate that part. It seems super shitty, that a seller could ever kind of have that leverage ability to really hold the escrow. If, the contract says that it's due to the buyer, then, we look at it kind of like it's a black and white scenario. They said, let's say the seller refuses to release the escrow, refuses to sign off on it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything stating that the seller cannot resell that property until those funds are released?
So this is where it gets even shittier.
So we thought you were going to say.
Yeah. So let's dive into this a little deeper. So by virtue of the buyer terminating, the buyer has basically said the contract is no longer binding, right? And the buyer has disclaimed any desire to purchase the property. So therefore, the seller would be free to sell to someone else.
Wow.
Now here's where you see it going. Okay, so let's say you have this seller that's just a terrible person, and right now, let's just be honest, sellers are incredibly entitled right now. Incredibly entitled. They believe that they're selling the Taj Mahal. They believe that everybody owes them at least 7 figures for the condo they bought for $95,000 last year. Like they're in this crazy place where there's this market where they can name their price. I mean, within constraints, of course, but they can name their price and people are lining up to write checks to them, right? So they're incredibly entitled, which gives them this mindset of, I deserve that deposit because I took my house off the market, and I had 15 people who wanted to buy it, whether or not the contract says so, right? And so they're in this mental space right now where they're just not behaving like normal people behave. And so that is an issue. I mean, there are some things to think about with escrow disputes. Like the first thing is there enough money in escrow that it's worth fighting over? Okay. The second thing, now in this market, generally the answer to that is yes, because generally buyers are really putting a lot of money down, generally. Now the second thing is, as a buyer, you start having to make business decisions, and business decisions, I say this a lot of times, principles cost money, and sometimes they're not worth the money they cost. Okay. And so when you hear a buyer say, I want to fight over my $50,000 deposit, they're not going to get a nickel from me. Part of my job is to try to explain to them, while that may feel gratifying, it doesn't solve their issue. And honestly, it's not a realistic goal. And the reason that is the case is because they're going to want their $50,000 deposit back. But in order to do that, they're going to have to hire one of my litigation brethren. And the first thing my litigation brethren is going to say is, I need a retainer. And that retainer is going to be $2,500, $5,000, and they'll burn through that money pretty quickly. And so part of my job is, and my litigator partners don't like it when I do this, but part of my job is to try to set an expectation with the buyer to say, sometimes it's better to give the seller a little bit of money to get access to your money to move on. And therefore, you're not going to be wasting time on the sidelines for 6 months. Sometimes, you know what? You get dealt a hand and the hand's terrible and they take the ante that you put in the hand, right? That's what happened here. You got a hand. It's a terrible hand. You put your ante in, but you don't have to lose your whole stack, but you're going to lose your ante. So let's figure out what that is and let's move on. And so, yes, it is sucky. The problem is when you look at it from the perspective of the person holding the money, there is no advantage to them releasing the money, and there's only disadvantage to releasing the money. I've never heard anyone get sued because they didn't release the money and because someone else had to resort to court action in order to get it. I've heard people get sued all the time when they've released the funds and then the other party claims they should not have done it, right? So it's just a lose situation for the escrow agent. And so no one's going to do it. Our firm included. We can't, if we get lawsuits for, sometimes we see deposits of $250,000, upwards of $500,000. We're not going to put our firm out there, and no escrow agent would, by releasing a $500,000 deposit without two parties signing it. I mean, that's a quick way to no longer have a law firm. We do 2 or 3 of those. We're making some serious adjustments to our budgets, right? That's just unfortunately where we're at. And there's not a great way to deal with it. It's just a function of living in a court system in the US. It's the best system in the world, in that every person has access to the courts, right? It's the worst system in the world because people have to pay people in order to access the courts, right? It is what it is. So that's probably more than you want to know, but those are just the practical issues of it. Moving on to leased property. Now the good news is, the lease eviction moratorium, obviously we know it's been lifted, but there is an issue, which I anticipate, which is all those people who were not paying rent are going to be foreclosed out, right? And there is going to be a glut of cases which are filed and in process in the court systems right now and in the near future, which means that there are effects that moratorium still has on access to courts. So the issues that we're seeing, there's an increased number of people with past due rent. There's no available rentals. The anticipated increase in volume of evictions and delay in eviction process. So we're dealing with leasing and we're dealing with evictions. Now, the issue you have to put yourself in, or the perspective you have to put yourself in, is, say you're a tenant, and say you're a tenant that was affected by COVID, and you are allowed to take advantage of the eviction moratorium. Say you're a tenant that has no ability at all to repay the rent that is owed over the last, year. Say you're a tenant that wants to move out. Where are you going to move to? There's no available rentals right now. So the issue is that you have people that maybe even want to move out, but they have no place to move to. And the rents have jacked up and gotten even higher and skyrocketed. And so these people are almost put in a position of having to be evicted, of having to stay to the last minute, and putting landlords in the process of having to evict them. So because of that, I think that anytime that you're buying a new property as a buyer and it's currently being leased, you have to be extremely careful and extremely informed about what it might look like to have to get rid of a tenant if they stop paying. And so it's just something to think about. So if you've got a buyer that's buying a property with a lease because they're desperate to buy a property, but they want to occupy that property. In other words, they're buying it subject to a lease, but they want to wind up getting someone out of that lease and moving themselves in. just be cautious and make them aware, because it's really hard to do that, particularly right now. And going hand in hand with this issue is, I know right now there's so many pre-closing and post-closing occupancies going on. There's so many of these things. But we need to remember that these things, while they're not technically considered to be leases, they come with the same issue that leases come with, which is, if someone is in possession that doesn't own a property, you have to evict them. There's not a process where you can just have the cops show up and remove them. They need to be evicted. And so what we're seeing a lot right now is sellers wanting to sell their house quick and then keep their house for 6 months while they're looking for a new place to buy. And so I think there has to be a real conversation that happens in that circumstance between agent and seller, or between attorney and seller, and between agent and buyer, and attorney and or buyer, right? And that has to do with what are the risks that a buyer might have if the seller occupies post-close. And it would be that the buyer has to access the courts in that same overclogged court system relating to eviction. And so now with the pre-closing occupancy, it's even more concerning. And so the one thing that you need to think about is, let's say you're a seller. Well, we talked about the seller example. Let's say you're a purchaser who's pre-closing occupying a property. One of the things that might be a common belief that they have is that they overpaid for the house. They know it's a seller's market. They know they've overpaid for the house, or at least that they have paid what it's worth currently in this market, which is far in excess of what it was worth, 2 months ago, what it was worth a year ago. So there's this highly escalating pricing right now. So purchasers may believe, based upon that they did what they had to do to pay for a house, but now they're in possession of the house, they overpaid for the house. If they come to the realization that they, as a purchaser, could refuse to close, and that the seller would need to evict them, which would then cost the seller time and money, can you see a scenario where that purchaser might renegotiate the price? I certainly can. Someone who's in possession, they certainly have more leverage over someone who's not in possession and has to take court action in order to remove someone. So the purpose of this is not to say don't do this. The purpose of this is to think through what are the practical issues with occupancy, and also to think to yourself, do you need to, as a list agent or as a buyer's agent, when these issues pop up, do you need to do one of these CYA emails so people aren't pointing fingers at you? So just be aware, again, of these pre and post closing occupancies. They're very similar to a lease, and the effect of signing them and the risks allocated with signing them are the same. So just keep that on your radar screen. The next thing is closing dates. And again, I'm not telling you not to do a quick closing. What I am telling you is that buyers need to understand what happens in a closing process and what the challenges are when we're doing a quick closing. And I understand that this is a function of what sellers desire in a seller's market. I get that. I fully get it. But the buyers need to be coached to understand their risks about, if they need a survey, getting a survey back. If they need estoppels, getting estoppels back. They need permit searches back, getting permit searches back. And if they need municipal lien searches back, getting those back in time. You and our office, we can only do so much to try to get that stuff back. Frankly, they're beyond our control, and the people that are dealing with those right now are overworked and underpaid. And so the issue would be, the abbreviated inspection period or abbreviated time for closing. The buyers bear significant risks if those things cannot be completed prior to closing. You know, an estoppel might indicate that a seller hasn't paid association dues for the last 3 years. That could be several thousands of dollars. You know, again, we already beat the dead horse on permits, but, you know, municipal lien searches, similar to estoppels, and then surveys, you know, those, if you need one, I mean, there's, in some circumstances, 8 weeks out if it's not in a community. If it's in a community, it might be 3 weeks to 3 weeks out. But, you know, if it rains, then surveyor can't survey. And so these issues of doing quick closings, they come with hair. And it's just important that the buyer understand that they might get to the close table without all the data that they need, and that they would have to take a risk in order to close. It's, again, just making sure they understand that, sending them a letter so they can be aware. All right. So off of the contract for a second, and here's an email that I received this past week. And don't be this guy. So this was written by a guy. So ladies, don't be this guy, but and guys, don't be this guy. So the title of it was Fraudulent Seller. And it went something like this. Hello, Jay. I hope all is well. I try not to bother you often, but I have a scenario that I need your help with. We listed a $65,000 lot from an out-of-country seller. The title company closed the lot, and then we discovered that the seller who signed the listing in the sales docs and received the proceeds was not the actual seller. The police were called, and the underwriter is working on getting the money back to the buyer. The real seller just sent us an email asking how we verified the seller's credentials before listing the lot. Sounds like he might want to put the blame on us. I just wondered what our exposure is for not verifying that a seller is the actual seller before listing a property. I just left you a voicemail as well. Thanks. I would like to say this is the only email on this I've gotten, but I've gotten a couple others, but it's not just my office. So here's a alert that was sent out from Old Republic Title, they're our underwriter. When you close with us, Old Republic is the actual underwriter of our transactions. It's kind of like we act for them as an agent, like a State Farm agent acts for State Farm. So Old Republic Title, which does title throughout the US, but certainly throughout Florida, sent out this warning about some suspicious property transactions that were going on in Punta Gorda, and then also one in Cape Coral. We just got in August, and we get these periodically, as you might imagine, but they seem like there's more and more that are coming out. I don't know if you guys had the opportunity to watch this broadcast, but I'm just going to play a little bit of this broadcast from Week News, kind of somebody's experience with these foreign people representing themselves as people that own property, but they really don't. So I'm just play this for a second.
Wink News happens now.
Live in the newsroom.
Wink News now.
Now.
Wink News now.
So now Wink News is happening weekdays at 3.
Oh, sorry, technical issue.
Wink News
now.
So now Wink News is happening weekdays at 3. We know you'll agree. Wink News is the place to be starting at 3.
Tonight from police about a growing problem in our hot real estate market.
Yeah, thieves are stepping up to steal and sell land that doesn't belong to them. New at 6, Wink News investigative reporter Sarah Girard shows us how crooks are tricking realtors in our community and what's being done to put an end to it.
We were doing everything at that point via email.
It's a recipe for property fraud. One person claiming to be a foreign landowner, a couple phone calls, many emails, and thousands of dollars up for grabs.
I sent him a listing agreement with my recommended price, which was $169,000. He signed the listing agreement, said that he thought the price was fine.
Southwest Florida realtor Peter Davis says it seemed like any other listing at first.
He said that he found me on Zillow, which isn't unusual.
So he went about his job advertising this property for sale.
A couple from Miami called me and had seen it online and wanted to make an offer.
That couple offered $150,000 for this golf access lot in Cape Coral, and the quote-unquote seller said it's a deal. Davis sent the contract to his title company.
My title company called me and they started asking me questions about this new deal that I sent them. And did he say it was German? I said, yeah. Did he say he was traveling? I said, yeah.
Suddenly, the red flags were everywhere. He called his buyers and told them to hold off on the payment. The purported seller tried to use another title company, but when that didn't work, eventually sent over a photo of his passport. But by then, the jig was up.
I just was irritated, and that I'd spent the money and the time and the effort, and my buyers got their hopes up and then dashed.
Eventually, the man stopped pushing and disappeared.
Luckily, my title company had seen this already, and so they were able to, intercede.
Davis says he's glad.
So that's a little scary, scary enough that the Cape Coral Police Department has put out a press release regarding this issue, and you can look more into that press release if you'd like by going to their website. But they did have some recommendations. Yeah,
we actually sent that press release out to everyone. I think it was last week.
Nice.
So you
Perfect.
should have it in your email.
That's great.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that you guys want to do specifically relating to that press release is look at these recommendations from the police department as to, how you and frankly, I can protect ourselves against this scam. So the scammers, you'll see they're wanting a valuation of the property and express a desire for a quick sale and closing. They're asking realtors to list the property below market value. They're communicating only via text message or email and are unavailable by phone. They're usually not able to answer any questions related to the property, such as when they paid an assessment or any kind of things about the seawall or other improvements. They may say that they live in one country and have documents notarized from another country, and they may give wiring instructions to an account in a third country different from the other ones. Check the documents the seller provides for authenticity, and foreign-based notarizations need to include an apostille to help the legitimacy of the identification. Try to contact real owners using information from the previous purchase. So that's a good tip. This one's a little too technical for me, but apparently you can verify IP addresses used to electronically sign documents. So through DocuSign and .loop, and you can see if the IP address matches the location of the purported location of the seller. A couple other things I think to consider when looking at listing property. The best referral is a personal referral. And so sometimes, referrals from people, well, every time if the person that's referring you know them, that's usually a place where you're like, okay, I feel pretty comfortable that this isn't this game. But the second one is it too good to be true? And I had something happen to a client of mine probably 4 or 5 years ago, where a foreign buyer basically talked them into making sight unseen offers on like 6 or 7 properties, and then they mailed in checks to a title company for deposits, and then attempted to pressure that title company to refund deposits. They terminated all the contracts. They attempted to pressure the title company to refund all the deposits before the checks cleared. Luckily, the title company didn't do that because all the checks bounced, and it was just really a scam to try to bilk money out of closing accounts or title accounts. And so the question I asked that guy when he came to me and said, what should I do? How do I get the sellers that I have? Because he had all the listings too. How do I make sure that they don't get sued for performance? And I said, well, I think it's unlikely under these facts that it would happen, but there's really not a lot you can do because crazy people do crazy things. But the question I asked him was, at what point did you realize, or didn't you realize, that it was just simply too good to be true, right? Like they wanted to buy every listing that you had at full ask without seeing them. Like at some point, it feels like it's too good to be true. So just keep your head on a swivel with this issue out there. It's definitely out there, particularly in the Cape right now. There are other markets where it exists as well, but the Cape, because there's so many foreign investors in the Cape, it's ripe with this. So be careful, being a foreign person right now with COVID, it's the perfect excuse not to travel. So the perfect excuse with the time differential to say it's easier for me to communicate by text or email because I can do that at my convenience. I don't have to wake up and call you. Like, there's so many things that can happen, or so many reasonable arguments that can be made that it looks normal. So just be careful. I know that we're taking care. We've had a few of these come in, and we were able to instantly identify them through various means, looking into the file. So just be careful. One thing you may want to do is consider, when you're taking a listing, if you can't meet with the person, asking them for a form of identification to be sent to you in some way. At least you could see whether or not they even have the appropriate identification, naming them as the person with a picture anyways. So that's just one thing. But certainly just try to be careful and try to follow those steps that were said again in the police recommendations. So one other thing I want to kind of preload, that's really the end of the conversation for this. I would like to, before we kind of open it up for questions or experiences, I'd like to talk about our conversation next month, which is our glorious FR and coming out with changes to the contracts. And so it feels like every time we start to get comfortable with contracts, they change, right? Like, so the changes will be including changes to the definition of what is loan approval, moving the timing of the appraisal when it must be obtained in order to terminate a contract, changes to delivery methods under the contract for notice, changes to definition of what personal property is being conveyed, changes to the timing when a buyer has to give notice under a loan approval, clarification of the seller's obligations to pay certain costs as part of closing. Additionally, riders are coming for mold, for seasonal and vacational rentals, and pace. And there's other changes coming. So don't miss this one. I always say that our contracts are our tools. And so we need to understand our tools, need to know how to use our tools, and need to know when they make changes or adjustments to our tools, what practical effects that they'll have when we're helping people buy houses. So I think it's a pretty important one to catch. And then the last one is, I would love to hear some of your war stories. I would love to hear anything that you guys have run into. The more that we can help others learn, the better, especially with experiences right now in this market where you found yourself in a pickle. So I'm going to get off of the screen share, and I will go back into the Zoom call and stop the share.
Hey, we see you.
All right, cool.
Thank you. I think that was, hey, we don't see you. That was very informative, I think. And yeah, we actually caught that press release and sent it out to everyone because I thought that was pretty scary. And thank you for elaborating even more on that. That was very good.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah.
So any questions, concerns, weird stuff happening? What's going on?
See, I mean, I have had buyers who've asked to reduce to have no inspection period. I always say, why don't we just offer a short inspection period? We can always get an inspector out pretty quickly. And then we have both. We'd still offer the seller something, but not everything.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's wise, right? Like, so I'm not suggesting that a buyer in this market give a seller a huge list of fixes. I don't think that's going to work.
No.
But I am saying that it's good to be informed about what it is you're buying, and you might buy something that makes it just a non-starter, a non-negotiable, where you're looking at it and you're like, I just simply can't buy this house because of the significant issues, like the ticky-tacky stuff. Like, I think it's important if you're going to do inspections as a buyer in this market, it's really important to set expectations as a buyer's agent as to what the seller is going to probably respond with little stuff. And so I really do think that 90% of all conflict in a contract is actually avoidable by setting proper expectations. And so if you explain to a buyer the reason why you're using, for example, an as-is contract in this market is to protect them from any significantly huge problems, but that if they have the expectation that the seller is going to fix anything less than a huge problem, they're crazy. They're not going to do it. So if you set that expectation and tell them, this is why we're doing the inspection, and I can assure you, if you ask for this, if you ask for small stuff, they're going to tell you no. So don't make them mad. Only ask for the non-negotiable stuff. Then hopefully they follow your advice. Typically, when you're the one showing them houses, they've picked you for a reason. They have a trust level with you. And so hopefully they'll follow that advice and your deals won't tank because they're asking for, the locks to be adjusted, like it's something stupid, right?
Hey,
Anyone
Jay,
else?
your CYA email that you had like on the second or third slide, I think it was,
Yeah.
are you reviewing it? I looked at that email like that'd be something like, by the time you receive our contracts, they're fully executed, so the buyer's already screwed.
Well, so I actually review them in advance for people if they want me to. So what happens is, like, if an agent, so for example, if you're an agent and you find yourself writing a contract that you're like, man, this contract is one-sided and you're on the wrong side of it, right? You can always say, hey, I always recommend a lawyer to review a contract before you sign it. And then I look, that email is a very brusque and abrupt email. They don't look like that when they actually go out, but it was prepared for a point, which is, these are significant issues that you need to be aware of. And so they're a little more flowery, a little less, don't sign this, and a little more, look, I understand that probably the market is dictating this, but it is important that you understand what you're not doing. And I'm certainly not suggesting not to make an offer that won't be accepted, right? I'm not suggesting make an offer that won't be accepted, but understand the contents of this offer mean the following things, right? And so that's really where the true email lies. But for our purposes, I can talk to you guys a little bit differently. So it's a little more direct when I do it in a presentation, which is, hey man, you're rolling the dice here, right? Like, that's what this is. You're rolling the dice. You're putting your deposit out there. You're putting a ton of money, and you're hoping that the roulette doesn't hit green, right? Like, you're hoping it's either black or red. That's what you're at.
I do think if you're okay with it, if we kind of steal that letter and revise it even slightly, just because I was saying that during the meeting to everyone here, I was like, it makes sense if you have a client that's saying to you, just like you said, Ben, they're asking you, hey, no contingencies. I would like to send the contract to them, but I would send that email with it saying, hey, I just want to clarify in writing, basically, like, I know I said it to you, but that tends to go in one out the other. So if I send it to you in writing, hey,
I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great idea, and I also think, like, it's like the way I would word it, if and you haven't asked me to word it for you, but the way I would word it would be like, to confirm our conversation, you have directed me to prepare a contract which does the following.
Oh, I like
Right?
that. I liked your initial way better, but I understand that we should do it the other way.
But make it clear that they've directed you to prepare the contract the way it's been prepared, not that you prepared it and then they just signed it, right? So you have to confirm our conversation, you've directed me to prepare the following contract, which has the following provisions in it, right? And that way, whenever that comes back, you can say, look, you directed me to do that. Clearly, I didn't just make it up. We had a conversation. I sent you an email which says this is based on your direction. You didn't object to that.
Theron, or whatever.
Sharon what?
Theron
Shirley.
Oh, bye.
I thought she was drafting it for me. I was like, go for it. Thereon, that's a good legal term. Or therewith, or therefore.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, we'll probably tweak it a little bit and send it out to everyone.
Yeah, I think that's just wise for you guys at this point in your in this market. There's no reason why you need to fall on your sword for a buyer that desires to make an offer that's really, really tempting and really, really stupid.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, as always, guys, I appreciate the opportunity to speak into your guys's life and to speak into your brokerage. If ever things come up, give me a call. Happy to help with language. Happy again to help with your closings. Just let me know how I can support you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay.
All right.
Glad you're feeling better.
Thanks. Me too. Bye all.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye. Do we have any other things we need to talk about before we go?
I don't think so. Next week, if you guys want to mark your calendars for it, we are going to be doing that follow-up with Chime.
Yeah, I
So-
would strongly encourage to follow the Chime courses because it is a great tool, but it's also a very complicated tool. You need to really learn to use it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great.
For sure.
Okay. Well, then till next time.